Hey everyone, this is Matt here. I'm going to be going over another chess opening in this video. This video is going to be covering the Ruy Lopez. It's one of the oldest openings and strongest openings for white in the King's Pawn opening repertoire. The opening starts out with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to f5, bishop to b5, attacking this knight on c6. Eventually, potentially pinning the knight once the pawn moves to the king. So this bishop to b5 is actually doing a lot of things. The other functions that this bishop is doing is indirectly attacking the e5 square because it can take away a defender of that square, and it's also making way for white to castle. Inside the Ruy Lopez, there are tons of variations. There's actually over 30 variations. And in this video, I'm just going to cover some of the most common variations that you will see. And the first variation is if black plays bishop to c5. This is called a classical variation. And from here, white is just going to castle kingside. And black will play knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn. This pawn is actually doesn't need to be defended immediately, and we'll go over a line in a moment with what happens if black decides to take on that square. But the main line continues with pawn to c3. Pawn to c3 is preparing pawn to d4, where it will then be attacking the bishop, and just having a strong center with the two pawns on the d and e squares. From here, black would castle, and d4 is played, attacking the bishop. The bishop backs up to b6, and white plays rook to e1 now, defending this pawn from being captured. Black now plays pawn to pawn to d6, putting an additional defender to the e5 pawn, so that in the event that this bishop takes the knight, the pawn isn't hanging from white's knight on f3. And from here, white's going to play pawn to h3, which is preventing the bishop from making use of g4, where it will then be pinning the knight to the queen. And the pawn on e4 is stealing the square from the bishop, so the bishop is really limited in where it can go, just simply from pawn to h3. And this is the main line before the opening breaks into more variations, and I just want to cover this part of it. Some things I do want to demonstrate from this position, though, in fact, is that capturing on d4 is not very good for black. The main reason is because that black is giving up a center pawn for a non-center pawn, essentially the c pawn. So, for example, if black were to capture, then white would recapture on d4, and now white has two pawns on d4 and e4, and black only has one pawn in the center. The other pawn is gone. So this isn't really beneficial to black. Black is better off maintaining the tension between the pawns so that white doesn't gain the center. In some variations, however, it is better to take, but as a general rule, you don't want to give up your center pawn for a c pawn or an f pawn, because the center pawns are more important to the position. Alright, well, another variation that you will see is the Berlin defense, which is knight to f6 instead. Again, attacking this pawn, but just as before, that is completely ignorable, and white can just castle in this position. From here, black has two main options. One is bishop to c5, which, as you can see, goes into the classical variation, just in a different move order. So white would then play pawn to c3, but we're not going to go over that again. So instead, black's going to play bishop to e7, and from here, white can play rook to e1, putting a defender on this pawn. And from here, we would see pawn to d6, again supporting this center that white has, that black has. And again, it comes this move comes right after the rook develops to the e1 square, just as before. From here, you normally see c3 with the same idea as in the classical variation. White's just trying to thrust this d pawn forward and maintain center pawns on the E and D file. And from here we will just see castles and then d4 from white. And again, capturing is not good for black in this position, at least not this early on. It's best to maintain the tension between these pawns because neither side does well to capture in this position. Okay, so that's the gist of the Berlin defense. Another thing that can be thrown into the mix is a6 at some point, which we'll go into that in just a moment. So let's go over another line in the opening. So bishop comes to b5, and what if the a6 is played immediately? Well, now white has two main options. White can either capture the bishop, white can either capture the knight on c6, or can play back to a4 and maintain the pressure on the knight. It's not good to come back to c4, otherwise what did white really accomplish? What was the point in playing here to b5? If a6 is played, you're just going to run back to c4. You kind of just gave black this move. So if you're going to come to b5, you really have to either capture the knight or play to a4 as white. So let's go over the exchange variation for a moment. So let's just say white captures. Black has two options. He can either capture with the b pawn or with the d pawn. Generally, you'll see the d pawn capture, simply to keep the pawns together and in still a strong and usable formation, rather than to isolate the a6 pawn by capturing with the b pawn. And it would be a mistake for white to capture here. Let's just say if white captures, it's not really a free pawn because the queen can just come here and the queen is forking the knight and pawn, so one of the two will be lost. Generally you'll just see the knight move, and now the queen comes here with check. So it's not really a free pawn for the white to capture in this position. And I'm not going to go into depth with the exchange variation. It's really kind of a draw variation, and it's really just white trying to maybe take advantage of the doubled pawns on the c file for black. It's also a much more simplistic variation, and one of the advantages of going into this is that there's not a lot more variations that come out of the exchange variation. So it helps to not have to learn and memorize as much opening theory. So that's the exchange variation, and white has another option when a6 is played, which is bishop to a4, maintaining the pressure on the knight. And this is really going to turn into the classical or the Berlin defenses, just with the bishop backed up first. So now black can just play the classical or the Berlin, or they can go ahead and thrust this pawn forward. Let's just say thrust the pawn forward. Then white's just going to play to b3, and again black can just play these openings that we had just gone over. The only difference is that this is played before the openings, which could have been played in the openings anyway, just later. So it's really the same opening, just with this played, this a6 b5 move played prior to the other main lines, rather than the main lines and then the a6 b5. In both cases, the move is going to get played at some point. So it's really a similar opening, and this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of variations in the Ruy Lopez. There's a lot of move order issues that can cause one variation to be exactly the same as the other, just it gets there in a different order, for example. So, alright, the last thing I wanted to go over in this video was when the knight captures on e4. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the Berlin variation. So knight here, and then we see castles, and then the knight captures on e4. And this is going to actually cause black some problems from this point. White is initially going to play pawn to d4, and pawn to d4 is threatening to just capture this pawn on the e5 square. And commonly from here you'll just see black pull the knight back to d6, attacking the bishop. The bishop can just capture. After recaptures, now white can recapture on e5, and this knight has to move. And unfortunately it's not going to be very good for white. Let's just say the knight moves to f5. Now the queens come off the board and black can no longer castle. In fact, we can go further from here and just say rook to d1, the king moves, and white can just start developing very easily with moves like bishop here or even here, and white's already developed, and black can no longer castle and is behind in development. So in that variation, black is worse off. So let's say instead of playing to the d5 square, let's just say black instead plays a6, attacking the bishop. The bishop can again take on the square, and now white can play the move rook to e1, which is attacking the undefended the undefended knight. There's a couple options for black. Black can play the knight to one of these squares, or black can defend the knight by playing one of either the bishop or the pawn to this square, and it doesn't really matter which way that black responds. For example, let's just say the knight comes to f6. Well, now white can just simply recapture this knight, this pawn, and has regained material with a discovered check in store for black. And the position is just fine for white and black in this position, but again, the pawn was not free. White regained the material at the end of the variation. So those are some of the very common lines you'll see in the Ruy Lopez. Hopefully you got something out of the video, and take care.